Ngalakin Khadijan Nyunga Boja.
It's Underwriter Laboratories. That's a US body. I can tell you cannot take that into the facility. You will have to park it in the admin building. I cannot take my phone, and I've seen people being kicked off assets straight away for not declaring the phone. And sometimes it's innocent. It's in your pocket, you don't realize it, you go in the field, you are in a zone 1 environment, and the phone rings. Shit. Right. And so, of course, people are being booted off. You have to declare everything. What we do have, though, is EX certified tablets and phones that we take to the field and are compatible.
Any other question? And those people who are online, please just type in or raise your hand. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So the students here are doing a design project. This unit is designing something. And they go through the different steps of the design from the concept to detailed design. Where in those design steps they have to pay attention to something like that?
It's a very good question, Ali. At concept. Now, one of the things that we haven't touched on during this presentation is safety in design. Now, safety in design is to do with, designing safety into your asset, into your engineered components, so that it doesn't raise a problem down the track. And the best way to implement safety in design is at concept. It's where you have the most control and sway. So hazardous areas is right at the beginning, at concept. And the reason why we say that is because whatever you select thereafter is impacted by whether it's a zone 0, zone 1, or zone 2 environment. If it's a gas group 2A, 2B, or 2C environment, your selection gets either narrower or wider, depending on what classification you do.
And in terms of responsibility, because you mentioned if you sign something and you might go to jail.
Well, only if it fails.
if it fails. Because sometimes you're doing projects as a student, just write a piece of code. They don't know where it is going to be used, and then we ask them to do a safety analysis. And sometimes it's because when you're designing an oil refinery, it is very tangible when we're talking about like safety and different zones. But if I'm just writing a piece of code for a microcontroller, and as an engineer, my task is only to write down that code, do I need to consider safety? And if someone uses that piece of code in a refinery and there is an explosion somewhere, am I responsible for that?
Well, I think first of all, if the code that you're writing impacts a safety critical piece of kit, or if it impacts a installation that falls within a hazard, and the code directly correlates to the way that that piece of kit is going to function under different environments, then yes, that code needs to be, applicable and written in a way that's going to be safe. But the responsibility lies with the OEM. And by OEM, I mean the original equipment manufacturers. They take the code and they apply it to their equipment. They then get it certified through a certifying body, and they get a certificate that says it's going to be safe for use under these conditions. And that's what the engineer takes and applies it in the field. So it's going through several steps before you can actually apply code in the on facility or equipment.
Thank you. Yep.
This might be a little bit of a silly question, but would something like ingress protection cover zone protection in any way, or would it be considered separate for dust and gas?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Would something like an ingress protection rating cover the zone classification, or would it be considered separate too?
The answer is no. in short, it doesn't, because ingress is only good while the piece of equipment is closed. Once you open it, what happens? What happens if the seal is failed? You cannot take that risk. especially externally, where it's quite, the environment can be quite damaging. You can be in a corrosive environment, you could be in a salt-laden environment, you could be, you know, just a rough environment where, you know, it can get damaged over time. And this is the problem with operations. Once the equipment's in there, right, it's, you know, unless it's a reputable operator, they don't really look after it very long. We've come across equipment over time where you sort of look at something and you're like, well, that's got to be scratched out straight away, because it is no longer safe. Like, keep going back to the example you picked me up on with the panel, right? That should have been scratched straight away, but it didn't. They just let it run till there's an incident.
Yeah, probably the last questions.
What's the battle between cost and safety? So in terms of developing all this explosive stuff, safety is a high priority, but stakeholders want stuff to be cheap as well. So is there like a battle between that?
I'll be honest with you, from a Clough perspective and from a contractor's perspective, there is no battle. Safety comes first, front and foremost. What we try and do is we find a fit-for-purpose solution. That is not circumventing safety. What we're doing is putting our smarts on, a bit of innovation to make sure what we're selecting is fit for purpose. You can gold plate, or you can have a fit for purpose design. But there is nothing that puts cost in front of safety first. Nothing.
All right, I see no question from the people online, so that would be it. So will you be here for info session?
Sure.
So we take a 5-minute break and then we switch to the other Zoom meeting for info session.
Thank you.
Please join me again.
Oh, yeah. It's, it was one particular
University, there's always money. That's right. Everybody goes for the. Yeah. Yeah, we have laboratories. Yeah, we have small tanks, maybe so we are forcing them to go outside, but then you need to figure out how to but so the cost on that. So that's no, this is the question. There are other topics that facility design is something we historically are very using. Because politics is
so can I invite you for next semester?
That was a very nice talk.
Yeah. It's going to be like an hour. Exactly the same. Because I think that's more relevant.
Yeah, well, safety design is also.
So you can't really sweat people. Yes, I can. Thank you so much. I'll see you.
Thanks, Henry. Try something different today.
You do it on your own computer?
We'll see if it works. Didn't work last week.
Is it HTML?
It is, but all right. Questions? Are we recording yet? Where's the record button? There it is. Okay, I thought the mid talk was fantastic. Yeah, great. Everyone submitted the requirements document. Woo, first milestone passed. Okay, so I need to crack several teams on the knuckles for not following the requirements, which was the naming of the document. Pretty simple. Had to have the team name in the document, and several teams didn't follow that requirement, which required about 2 hours of my time on a Friday night when I preferred not to be working to email people saying, oh, yep, I see you submitted documents that aren't right. So the next phase is you doing the feedback, and you can't give feedback on a document if you don't know which team the document belongs to. So naming the document is pretty important. So please, someone asked me several years ago, or I asked a student several years ago who was doing really well, and I said, what's your secret? How do you do really well in your units? And he says, I read the instructions, I read the guidelines, I read the requirements, and I do them. Okay? And that's how he's doing really well. If I go to submit, I think I've used this example before, we have grants that we apply for every year. 100 plus pages of grants, takes about 2 months to write it. You involve about 3 or 4 people, so it's a really big exercise. Success rate's only maybe 15% or so it's a really hard win. But if you upload the document and if you don't name things correctly, if you don't follow their requirements, the first thing they do is they reject your application that goes out straight away. So they just cull 10% really easily. No, not eligible for review because you didn't follow the guidelines. So please make sure the first thing you do always is follow guidelines. Submit tenders or whatever and you don't do it correctly, just doesn't even get considered. So make sure you understand what those guidelines are. I think it was my one rant I wanted to have. What was the other one? Okay, so for this week, you should be doing the reflection. We've broken it down into a series of questions that pretty much follow the rubric that you should have been following anyway. So I think I've set the word limit at each response to about kind of 1 word each. What we're looking for is around about 300 words, and I think that comes to about 3 paragraphs. Don't really want long strings of sentences, so if you prefer bullet points, that's all fine as well. But we're just looking for insightful comments for you to give as feedback to the teams that you're reviewing those documents for. So please take some time, read the report you've been assigned, have a look at the questions that are being asked of you on the Turnitin assessment, then sit and then write your responses, think about it, give it some detailed thought. Please look at the weighting of the assignment and please provide feedback commensurate with the weight of the assignment. If you treat it as a really trivial exercise, it may hurt. Let's see what I want to say about that. Okay, we're talking about questions about the requirements. The requirements have been submitted, so I'm not expecting many questions today. Did anything come out of the creation of your documents that made you think, I wish I'd asked Adrian this question. We didn't really resolve this correctly. We had to just piece it together for the requirements document, but maybe I should get that resolved. I mean, often the process of actually sitting down and writing something like a requirements document actually makes you realise that you didn't understand it in the first place, or there was some gap in knowledge. So, thank you.
Because some visitors may also have campus card, are they allowed to use this access?
Sure. It's just a database issue. There's nothing different from so the question is can a visitor use their visitor's card on this system? And the visitor's card that is issued is exactly the same as a student card or a staff card. It's a campus card. So there's no difference. If they came here, got a card, they were then trained to use a particular piece of equipment, they would be added to the database and then be allowed to use the piece of equipment. So, good question. Go for it.
Wait. Because people online can't.
Yeah, people online can't hear. That's why I'll try and repeat the question, but it may be easier if we just hear it first time directly.
Not really a client question, but in terms of expectations for the next phase of the unit, so week 7 to week 12,
Yep.
what do you actually want us to deliver, or like what is actually required, would you say?
Okay, so the most important thing, I think we tried to stress last week, the most important thing is that you're not building it. Right? That's the most important to understand. So it's a mistake to start sitting down and going, how can I write code for this? How do I design the printed circuit board? Those bits are not something you should be doing. It's really high-level thought about what's going into the system. The kind of things Hamid was talking about today, really thinking through, are there any safety issues associated with deploying this? So what you want to eventually deliver is something that the client would go, that's fantastic, I'll buy that. And that they could then go, right, I'm pushing the start button, let's go. Now, once you push the start button, it should just be a matter of saying, we've got firmware, software requirements, we've got hardware requirements, we've got electronic requirements. So if I was to form a team, I would take your document and I would just divvy up the various portions to my new team and say, you're the EE on the team, you're the mech on the team, right? Your job's to build this bit. So, follow the specifications, follow what was outlined in that report, and do what it says. Just basically deliver on what was required. So what you don't want to do is have something so that when someone reads it, they go, I don't really understand what they mean, I'll just build something else. Right? You really want to make sure, so in big teams, the A, B, C sections of the teams that aren't talking to one another but have their requirements document, all they have to do is deliver the widget. And if they know that the widget has to have these dimensions, it has to fit within these boundaries, it has to talk to this other piece of equipment, has to have these physical connections. So someone else handles those other various bits, all say that the electrical engineers need to do maybe is make that printed circuit board to these dimensions, fitting these requirements, allowing it to be programmed in this way according to these specs, and then the coders sit down and would either write the code and for the firmware, maybe write some interface code for a database system to maybe handle the authorization bits and pieces, then the comms, so all of those bits. So does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up on that. So basically it's like just an extended user manual, so like if we give you the client our product, you can be like, oh, everything is sorted out.
Yeah, so it has to be something that convinces the client that you can do it and that they understand what's involved. So as you progress through it, I should have a much better idea of what it's going to cost eventually. So from week 5 to week 12, that I suspect that is there another costing analysis that you'll do at the week 12 in the final report? Have you looked at the requirements?
Yeah, in final report they have to provide a
so
section.
Your costings may change from where they were in the document that you just submitted, because you'll have a much better idea of what it's going to take to deliver. So the client's now going to get, how many we've got? 20 groups?
26.
26. Okay, so I'm going to end up with 26 reports as a client. Right? I might just go to the cost page and go, which one's cheapest? That one. That's fantastic, right? I might do that, and then I might flick through the rest of the document and go, oh, but this system's really crap. It doesn't give me what I wanted, right? It gives me 50% of what I wanted, right? So I go through the other documents and start looking. Oh, okay, these are more expensive, but they've given me a better range of options. Or I think this one's feasible. Right? So you've given me one that maybe is really cheap, that's great, but I read it and go, I don't really think you can deliver on this. I don't think you've thought it through. I don't think these costs really reflect what it's going to take. So if I as the client don't have faith in that report, I'll shelve it and I'll go to the next one. So you want to convince the client that it's completely feasible, it's going to work, and it's going to cost me this much. That's what I want to know. And it's going to have these features, right? Don't leave the client thinking you have no idea what you're doing. You ain't going to win the contract. Go for it. Yeah. I'll do this one. I'm closer. I'm going to beat you.
So in terms of feasibility, in the final report, for example, if I was buying the final design, I'm not necessarily reading or caring about whether it complies with Australian standards to an extent. I just sort of assume to a point that it will be like feasible in the Australian market, and you will be able to buy and implement without going to prison pretty much. So in the final report, how much emphasis do you think we should put on convincing you that it's up to standard?
I think you absolutely need to convince me that it's up to standard. So if I actually own the workshop here, which has got lots of rotating equipment, lots of band saws, CNC machines, there's lots of opportunities for people to lose fingers and hands. And if I think that your box, the only way it's going to work is if you place it right next to the spinning blade, right, then I think you haven't paid enough attention to that. So I want to know that, and especially where a lot of the equipment might go into this access tool might go into a lab that goes into first year, where we have people that have never entered a lab before and never had a kind of a lab experience like it that would have at university, where here's a set of instructions, you'll have a lab facilitator, but go through, run this lab. They don't have any idea what they're doing, and they're wiring stuff up. Now, we don't have power labs here anymore, do we?
They are planning some for power, for machine and.
Yeah, I hope they get the power labs up.
You should probably ask Chris or Tyrone.
So classic power labs. When I was a student doing power, and hopefully we get some experiments back, where you'd have two rotating machines, each running with a different frequency, and you have to get them in sync, both frequency and phase, and then you have to electrically connect them together. Now, if you don't quite get that right, you get a big bang, right? It's a really good lab that talks about how if you're trying to shift electrical energy from one state to another, how you can do that using a control of power factor and phases. And it's a really tricky thing to do, and you have these massive generators. If you don't sync them up right, it's extremely dangerous. So if we were to run a lab like that, and students are accessing these particular tools, and there's a facilitator that maybe is turning all the tools on, I want to absolutely know that facilitator knows what they're doing, they're authorised to use that equipment, and where the hell am I going to put this box so that it's on potentially big machines that are rotating. So convince me is the key bit. Convince me that the team has spent a good amount of time understanding the discussions that people like Hamid have been having with us. You ain't going to cover everything. It's not going to happen. I appreciate that, but I'm asking you to really spend time at least drilling into some areas where you feel confident. There's a lot of discussion around those Australian standards. If you get to the end of this unit and you haven't cracked open an Australian standard and had a read of it and fallen asleep at nauseam of reading pages, but keep going. There's somewhere in there. Does the wiring test? Does the wiring standard have the finger test, or is the standard finger, or it has a standard finger that you should not be able to stick a standard finger inside this box, right? As a metric of is it safe? Standards cost bucket loads of money. You saw Hamid talking about, I hope it's okay, I put these standards up. They're very protective about those standards. You have access to them here at this university. Go and have a look at those standards and what's contained within them. It would be an absolute crime for you to get to the end of this unit not having read through a substantial portion of a standard and at least understand the kinds of things. I mean, that Australian New Zealand 3000, it's about the third speaker, I think, so far that's banged on about that standard. So, you know, and it's part of, I mean, when we talk about accreditation of our courses, and we talk about what does the industry advisory panel feed back to us, and what does Engineers Australia say has to be part of the training of our engineers, they bang on about risk, they bang on about hazards, and they bang on about Australian standards. So you have to be able to leave this place and demonstrate that you've engaged with some of that. And so this design report's a great opportunity to do that. So please, delve into it.
Say we require some sort of certification for a piece of equipment. Do we have to do in-house calculations to show that we've considered everything in installing that piece of equipment to show it's safe?
I have to think about an example. The problem with this is that it is so open-ended, this project. You know, you're dealing anything from an oscilloscope to a, big, rotating motor, for example. So it's really hard to think about what might be required for every single piece of equipment. But if the generic installation of that equipment requires some kind of certification, then yep, I want to see some kind of calculations, I want to see some kind of analysis, probably might be a better word, because I don't know if it's going to actually involve numbers, but it may require analysis. So there's lots of ways to learn stuff through this unit, through, go and dig up case studies, look for equivalent products on the market, reverse engineer stuff. Reverse engineering is highly underrated. I used to teach a mechatronics unit where about a third of it was just about reverse engineering stuff. Here's a screwdriver, there's an old DVD player, pull it apart, tell me how it works, tell me how you'd make a better one. There's lots of tech inside equipment, right? So you can read someone's patent and learn a whole lot about how that technology works. Reverse engineering is standard practice in engineering, right? You've got to learn some way, and companies won't tell you how they're building their product. So the only way for you to learn is by pulling it apart and figuring it out. And there's lots of laws around copyright, but copyright's an interesting one because copyright is there to protect the inventor of the what's it called, the embodiment of the object, but copyright is not designed to stifle creativity. So you can't copyright something and say, and no one is allowed to try and copy me and follow in this path. So there was an early case of Sega creating video games and making a cartridge that was proprietary and encoded so that it would only play on Sega machines, and then third-party companies came along, reversed engineered their cartridge, figured out how their cartridge worked, and started making their own games in cartridges that could plug into Sega's machine and play their games. And Sega tried to sue them, saying they're infringing on copyright. And I believe the outcome of the case was this company was just trying to be creative themselves. You can't wrap copyright around something to try and kill creativity in some other field. So, learn whatever you need to learn via various means without actually breaking the law. But reverse engineering is, in most cases, not breaking the law. Although the Digital Millennium Act says something about digital media and the rights to reverse engineer that, but won't go down that space. All right, so that's my little rant. Come on, more questions.
Just let's check with people online as well.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
If you have any questions, just type in or raise your hand.
Please do. Bring up the little chat pane.
Yep.
Yeah, Adrian. So let's say if I have a product, the one that I'm giving to you, it complies with all the Australian standards, everything's fine. But as a client, does it matter to you whether the material of it, how big is it? Do you care about that?
How big the widget is?
Yeah, so like it doesn't matter if it works. So it complies with all the standards. It does all the required functions.
So if I've got I've got an oscilloscope that's running in a lab, and I'm just picking on these random examples. I only got a few examples in my head. So my oscilloscope is only this big by this big. If you say attached to every oscilloscope, you just have to put my box, and my box is yay big by yay big, then I'm not going to roll that solution out on every single box, right? So physical size has some impact in the way I could do this, right? But classic one. Clients always think electronics is small. You can always integrate something and make it small, so do that. The first one of anything is never very small. So certainly conceptually, remembering that you're not delivering a final thing, you're delivering your thoughts on what's possible. But I would have never thought that a Raspberry Pi would be the size that it is, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So how big something is really depends on how much integration you can do. You can always build a single chip with all the functionality you want in it, but it costs about $500,000 to make that chip, and you have to make a minimum water run of 100,000 kind of thing. So you can always integrate a lot of the technology that you want into small form factors, but it just costs money. Good kind of interim solutions to that are things like FPGAs. But ASICs cost about $500,000. Got to get more microphones.
So you've specified in the requirements that you want to include some sort of interlock device and an external card reading unit. Can we attach other things to equipment, like let's say some sort of tag for equipment location?
Look, how you do that is your choice. So if you want to come up with an equipment location method that requires some other bit to be added on, and you can do it at a reasonable cost and you think it's going to work, then make that proposal, flush it out. I want to, as much as possible, not tell you how to do it, because again, I'll kill creativity if I tell you how to do it. I've already heard a few ideas around how different groups are thinking of implementing it, which have made me go, wow, I'd never take that tack on it. That's a really interesting approach. I wonder how that's going to be flushed out. Please be creative.
Kind of expanding on that with location tracking. For some methods, like with GPS, you can use it fairly easily in most situations, but when you do go underground or do need additional things, there are kind of optional ways to keep having that GPS signal be located. Will that be necessary, or will it?
I don't know what GPS is. I'm a civil engineer. I mean, no. But so I don't. Today it's GPS, and tomorrow it's micro Wi-Fi systems, and I mean, so I don't know how something is done. I'm stupid. Right? I'm the client. I'm telling you what I want, right? As the engineers, you all need to tell me it's just not possible, or this is the closest we can get to you. We're not all Iron Men. We don't have suits, kind of.
But would having optional availability, should that be requested? Would that be allowed within the
optional availability of location?
So there's something called I think it's a repeater.
Yep.
That allows you to find GPS locations when underground. Obviously, that's not necessary everywhere.
No.
Would that kind of
if that's your solution, sounds completely reasonable. Flush it out. Right, so if you think, right, we want to stick with this, whatever GPS stands for, right, solution, but we understand the limitations of it. This is how we're going to get around the limitations of it, and this is the impact for it. So it's simple to implement on this particular equipment, but for every 10 pieces of equipment, you have to have one little kind of repeater stuck somewhere. And we have wireless nodes all over the place. Maybe you go, okay, this is something we can whack up. Whenever you do one of those wireless nodes, you can whack one of these repeaters up. So again, if you demonstrate, if we say there is huge value to the university in doing this because of safety, because of management of equipment, then the upfront cost maybe isn't that important. And if you say, well, there's one repeater and it's going to cost X, and it will service 100 smaller nodes or pieces of equipment, and so the cost of that is nothing compared to each individual, putting this access piece on each piece of equipment. So, yeah.
Just to clarify on that, so there is like an antenna on every building, and then it talks to...
Yeah, so repeaters, basically, you have one end of the repeater in the room or the area where you want the device, and then you'd have one on the outside that can detect a GPS signal.
Yeah, you're basically building another kind of a wireless network. That's just kind of, and how you do that, it could be GPS. Maybe you just go, we're going to build our own micro cellular network, to do spatial location.
Part of the question is, would we be allowed to have that as an optional thing? Should the university request
I think nothing is not allowed.
Yeah.
If you can justify it,
if that's your solution, I think it's really interesting, and we want to hear about it, right? So it's all about come up with, out of the box solutions. If you get to a point where you go, I can't figure out another way we could do this, I think that could work. That's great. Go through the process of flushing that out. Form a little subgroup within your team and go, right, we're divvying up the core bits of the tasks at the moment, and we've identified that most of the stuff's pretty pedestrian. We think it's pretty easy to go through. We'll check the standards, we'll write these bits up, we'll do this, we'll investigate this, but this section here is really a huge unknown. So we need little brain space around how we're going to do it, flushing out ideas. Someone, will come up with the ideas. Half the group come up with the idea, and the other half of the group sits there and tries to pick at the idea and say why it's a terrible approach, right? So you've got to have that critical feedback in order to kind of get those ideas really flushed through.
Adrian,
Yep. Oh, here we go. Sorry. I want to know whether each building has its own local computer room or server, and whether I can assume that they can store the authenticated database and handle offline situations on the LAN. So to the question, whether each building has its own local computer room is probably a reasonable assumption. Now, whether they can store the authenticated database, if I understand the question, it's kind of implying, so it's not a wireless network, it's a local area network. So LAN to me implies physical wiring. So you're talking about whether your equipment can physically be wired back to a server room, where that room might contain the local database, so that if the network goes down, that you wouldn't need to worry about, you'd still be able to access the equipment. Now, when we say if the internet goes down, so that could be Wi-Fi, that could be LAN, that could be, it would really be unclear whether having a physical wired connection back to a server room would help in any way with having access to that database. as a client, I'm a noob. Memory's cheap, So, how can something not store a database locally? It sounds like a simple idea, right? Now, there are issues around that. Craig Williams already touched on some of those kind of security issues. Am I getting to the heart of the question? I mean, the first part is, yes, you can assume there's a server room in most buildings. Whether that server room would... So I think it's fair to say, there is what's called a comms room in most buildings. So the comms room in most buildings is where most of the fibre or conduit runs, and from there connects to the larger network across the university campus. There may be no server in that room. As far as you know, the server might be offshore in the US, could be at Amazon, right? Could be anywhere, right? Where our servers are, we don't talk about.
I think that's the case for card access because it's linked to Gallagher. Do you know where it is?
No, that's right. It's in the cloudy thing. It's fluffy, it's white, it's out there. Could be on campus, could be next to me, could be this computer here, as far as you know. Who knows, right? So, assuming that there's a server in every room and every computer is probably an incorrect assumption. But there's a comms room, yeah, it's probably a reasonable assumption.
Can we assume that all the equipment we are dealing with are using 240 or single phase supply?
Yes, that's it. I think I've said that several times, but yes, the only other one would be 3-phase, and we're saying no, 3-phase is out. 3-phase is another can of worms. We need to draw a box around this somewhere. 240 volt, single phase.
Yeah, so as a client, if we justify the cost reduction, perhaps 30% or something, but remove one of the requirements from the project brief, will you accept that? Or would you want everything to be met, but don't care the cost reduction?
I really want everything to be met. You can lay it out as you can save 30% by not having this feature, but I don't want it to read like you can save 30% by not having this feature, and therefore we all decided not to work on it. Because it sounds like you're then submitting a report that's non-competitive with all the other groups who did include it in their spec. So, and then it makes it hard to grade your work. Have you really met the specification? Because everyone else investigated what the issues were there. So I would just frame it as here's the cost of implementing each one of these requirements. That's great. As a client, maybe that's all I care about, right? But equally well, you could say this is the time delay, or to roll out this solution as a result of choosing that. So this potential solution over here to location tracking using the additional repeater, right? So you might say, yeah, I can build this little product that can go onto every little piece of test equipment quite easily. That's great. Yeah, but every single room now needs that repeater, and that needs to be bolted onto the ceiling and wired across the whole university. So you might be able to say, well, you can have this solution, all right, but this other solution here you can have as well at this cost, but also it's going to take 12 months more, after rolling out your initial solution, because is cost the main issue? Is it time to delivery? Is it safety, overall safety? So it's not always cost. Sorry to have died in.
I was just checking too. It's okay.
Yep.
So is there a class here? Because we're...
Are we getting close?
10 to...
We're 10 to...
4.
Okay. There's no one who...
There's no one coming.
No one seems to roll in after this class, so I suspect there's not. So, happy to field more questions, but it's getting late on Monday. I don't want to bang on. Question.
So going down some of the same track of offering multiple solutions to a problem, how in-depth must each solution be?
Again, how in-depth? It's like saying how do I win that contract? How do I, so it needs to convince me as the client that you can deliver it and that what you're saying is has been flushed out. So it's not a matter of let me bang on for a page about something that, so you address something in one paragraph and then you decide, I think I need to talk more about this. You've resolved it in that one paragraph, but you decide to write another page. It's probably a page that's not required. If your arguments are strong, that's great. I highly, writing is really something you need to develop. Everyone needs to develop. Sometimes you need to draw a picture and not write words. Right? Sometimes if you're trying to get a point across, you may be better off stopping and crafting some kind of visual that represents what you're trying to say, and then write a paragraph around that, job done. And that's a way better use of a page than just continuing to give basically repeating the sentence that you've just given without adding the value.
The argument just needs to essentially convince you. That's all.
Yeah, it needs to be a strong argument, and that's it. So you might do that through. Let me give you a case study. Let me give you an illustration here. Let me give you nothing because my argument was so clear. It doesn't require any of that. So it's the how long's a piece of string thing. You need to convince the client that what you've put together is a strong body of work. It's not. We're not going for. We don't put them on scales when we go to. There's a word count with the final one.
There would be a word count.
Okay, so we always write. I always say write twice as much as you need. So I don't know what the word count is. Find the word count, double it. Just write twice as much. Then the job of the rest of the team is to take a red pen and delete, and just go through and really craft. Right, working in teams is about getting critical feedback from your other team members on what you wrote, really critically. So writing more is always good, with the understanding that someone's going to take a red pen and just